Hi, I'm Maud Barlow, and I am absolutely delighted to introduce this wonderful documentary you're about to see. I'm a Canadian. I've been fighting for water justice, the human right to water, and to protect water for many, many years. I've been to your beautiful country quite a few times, and one of them, I had the great pleasure of touring the Moorabool with some of the wonderful people who've helped make this film. It is an absolutely magical, exquisite river that you are all fighting to protect, and I totally support you in this. It's really important for us to understand that it isn't just the Moorabool, though, that all the waters of the world, all the rivers and lakes, and in fact, the groundwater of the world is in trouble. We're extracting and depleting and polluting our planet's water at a terrible rate. So we must all become water activists, water justice activists, and we must all protect the water for the next generations. And that means we have to keep democratic control over water. It mustn't be allowed, in my opinion, to be traded and sold or held by private interests, because it is a commons, it is a human right, and it is a public trust. And it's really important that we understand that. So here's to the Moorabool. Here's to this wonderful documentary. Here's to those of you who are going to protect this beautiful river. Long live the Moorabool. I'll come back to see it.
This is about life. I can't put it in words what I feel when I come here. It's something that's so very special. And I've actually not seen anything like this anywhere around on Watherung land. This is the most special spot I've ever seen in my life. My people have been here thousands of years. Colonisation is about 227. But we're all here now, and this place is worth fighting for.
When I first moved into the Geelong region, I was living where this river enters the sea at Barwon Heads through the Barwon River estuary. I didn't know the Moorabool River, but I'd heard of it, and the thing that was known about it and talked about was the fact that it's the most flow-stressed river in the state of Victoria. And without ever having seen the Moorabool River, I just thought, well, that's a pretty sad river, and it must be really degraded and, you know, shadow of its former self. And I expected to see something pretty sort of sad and dilapidated. But when I did get to see bits of the Moorabool River, I was struck by how magnificent it actually is, even though it is the most flow-stressed river in the state. It's got these amazingly beautiful gorges and a really striking river valley.
So the Moorabool River starts up near the Wombat Forest. There's two branches, the east and the west. They join above Morrison, and then from there it's about 100 odd kilometres. It makes its way to the Barwon River, past towns like Meredith and Bannockburn and Batesford, and finally at Finesford. It joins the Barwon River just on the outskirts of Geelong. When you look at the various statistics, the Moorabool is rated as the most flow stress in Victoria. It's really a river that we can look at and say this is how things shouldn't be allowed to progress this far. Over that journey it goes through some incredibly beautiful country, but there's also areas of it which are terribly degraded. Over that journey as well, a lot of water is taken from the river, either taken from the river or not allowed to get into the river through dams. Most of the rivers in Victoria, that if you take the extractions over 30%, those rivers are considered flow stressed. The Moorabool River, by the time you get down to its confluence at Geelong, over 90% of the water has been taken from the river. So where traditionally we had 90 megalitre flows, that's now been reduced to 10 megalitres. So in some years the river barely gets to the confluence with the Barwon River. So when you look back on the history of the Moorabool, it's been one of basically taking from it. It's gone from marshy, wooded areas with plenty of fish in it, sustained Indigenous populations along it. But right from the word go with settlement, it started being dammed in various places. The gold rush had a huge impact on it, with water taken for sluicing. And then the growth of the towns like Geelong and Ballarat meant that water supplies had to be found for those towns, and the Moorabool being close and convenient was the one that really copped the brunt of diversions for towns along its length. So slowly the water from the river has been taken for human consumption. So where does all this water go? At the top of the catchment, there's an extensive groundwater bore field used for agriculture and growing potatoes and all the rest of it. The science says for every megalitre of water that comes out of that bore field, that's 0.6 less of a megalitre that makes the river. Just down from that bore field, the damming starts. There's reservoirs like the Coinjibora, the Bostock, the Moorabool, but below those again, there's a huge reservoir, and that's called Lal Lal. And when you compare Lal Lal reservoir to what is on the Barwon River with 3 times the flow, the Lal Lal reservoir is actually 3 times the size of the West Barwon reservoir on a river with 1/3 the flow. And it's pretty obvious that this must have a huge impact on the river, and it does. Inflows into the Moorabool in any one given year are around about 100,000 megalitres. That 100,000 megalitres also represents a figure for what is actually captured by the water authorities in their dams. The river's largest dam, Lal Lal Reservoir, has a capacity of 60,000 megalitres. 2/3 of that is piped to Ballarat, and the other third is actually allowed to flow down part of the river to an offtake at Sheoaks, and then that third then goes on to supply Geelong and the wider region. There's other extractions from the Moorabool, stock and domestic, and irrigators, although they make up a fairly small percentage. One of the huge factors though is all the other dams, the farm dams. Compared to any other catchment in Victoria, the Moorabool River catchment is far and above the worst for having water collected in farm dams. The figures for that is about 23%. 23% of the annual flow is captured in farm dams in the Moorabool catchment. Capacity-wise, that's the same as the West Barwon Dam in the Otways. It's a huge amount of water. So you add that to the huge amount extracted for urban water use and the water that comes out of the bore field, and it's a little surprising to imagine why the river is in the state that it's in. What this means for the river is that it's really vulnerable to drought. The millennial drought in 2007 actually resulted in the small amount of passing flows that were coming from Lau Lau being turned off and water being trucked to townships like Meredith. This meant that we saw a river that just dried up before our eyes. It doesn't have the resilience that some of the other rivers have. There is an environmental allocation which is keeping the centre of the river alive, or the middle section with a small amount of flow. But this river is really poised to be really impacted by just a lower than average rainfall year.
Well, the Moorabool sits within the Mediterranean zone, effectively, of southern Australia. Because of the increased heat in the tropics, the high pressure systems are intensifying and they're tracking further south. So on account of that, you have a longer dry season. It starts earlier and finishes later, and you have a shorter wet season. So the long-term prognosis for Western Victoria on account of these changes to global circulation is it is likely to experience extended periods of considerable desiccation, and that will become the norm into the future. And the equable average years will become rarer and the wet years rarer still. So we need to be prepared for extended drying periods, and droughts in the past will become more of the norm into the future. What that means in terms of the river, of course, is that it will be longer in summer and autumn when the flows are very low, and we'll have a shorter period of higher flows, and it's the higher flows which drive breeding activity in aquatic biota, and so they'll have a shorter period of time of higher flows in which to carry out the full breeding season. So if you reduce annual rainfall, then you start to move into much more variable climates. And we can explain that in terms of circulation. We will still have the winter westerlies, so we will still get those intensive rainfall events that come through in winter on a weekly basis, and we'll have more intensive summer rainfall, but that'll be very challenging to rely on that as a rainfall source. And then we'll have extended dry periods, and those dry periods will be more intense. So we know that we're going to have increased flooding because the denuded catchments will be more catchment efficient. That is, the runoff ratios will be much greater for each rainfall event. But also we'll have extended dries, so we need to be prepared for extended or longer periods of low flows as well. So the variability will increase. We'll have these big floods as we experienced in 2010 and 11, but we'll have these extended dries that we experienced during the big dry at the end of the last century, which I think is probably continuing on into this.
Rivers keep running when there's no rain. And they keep running when there's no rain because it's the groundwater that's seeping into them. It's called base flow. And that groundwater keeps those rivers running. So the part that we forget about, the part we can't see, the groundwater, is terribly, terribly important to rivers. Before settlement, the Moorabool was really fed by the springs around Bungaree. These springs were tapped for Ballarat's water supply. When that area got cleared, a lot of those springs were dammed for summer crops, mostly potatoes. So the Moorabool is receiving less groundwater discharge than it used to. And so what we're seeing with the Moorabool is a decline in those low flows because the groundwater is also being deviated or diverted away from the river. So monitoring the groundwater in Western Victoria, there are a few bores. Where we do have a few monitoring bores, what we've been seeing since about 1996 is this decline in groundwater levels. With the millennial drought, they really dropped a lot and they haven't bounced back to where they were. And this is a great concern because it's that groundwater that feeds the wetlands, the Ramsar wetlands, the rivers, the lakes, all those sorts of things. So it's very difficult for me to say why the drop in water table, the lowering of the water table is occurring. I suspect it's climate change. I suspect it's the fact that we're getting less and less rainfall to top up the water. But you'd also have to say that there's more extraction of that water. So when we look at a river like the Moorabool River, it's a complex beast. We've got all the components of the hydrologic equation, farm dams, changes to the landscape, water flowing down the river, water being diverted, water coming in from different catchments. It's a complex thing. What we really need to understand, the process of how all that works, if we're trying to work that out, we need to have the data to understand that. And that's where we're missing so much in the Moorabool. We don't have the data. Those data are required to understand how the river works. Understanding how the river works should be what directs policy. How do you manage a river if you don't understand how it's working in the first place? And so I think the policymakers at the moment are working on the best science that we've got, but it's really not good enough, particularly where we're facing climate change.
There's two things which are really putting pressure on our rivers. One is climate change, less water. The other is population growth, more people. So we've got a smaller pie and more people wanting a share of it. And the bit in the middle is the river, completely squeezed. The Victorian government actually did a really ambitious thing. They tried to work out how much water availability has declined over the last 15, 20 years. They showed that water availability in southern Victoria has declined by up to 20% in the last 15 years. So it's a pretty significant impact. And that every single river in southern Victoria, the environment's share of the water has been more effective than consumptive water. So the pie's got smaller and the environment slice of the pie has got smaller still. So it's a pretty dire situation that we're in. The pie's shrunk because of climate change. The reason why the environment's share of the pie is getting smaller is to do with the way we hand out water, the way the government actually allocates water for use. Consumptive use is prioritised over the environment, and that's really vulnerable to dry conditions and climate change.
We're standing in a precious remnant of the upper regions of the west branch of the Moorabool River, and we can see here this remnant with wonderful manors and blackwoods and swamp gums and also an understory. But unfortunately, most of that throughout the length of the Moorabool has now been modified. And so downstream you would have had things like mosaics of wetlands and grasslands and billabongs. But since industrialised agriculture, I would guess somewhere between about 3/4 and 4/5 of the catchment has been radically modified. And so the Moorabool is a reflection of its catchment, as is any river. And so what we see as a result of the removal of vegetation is radical changes to the ecology of the river. So removing that deep-rooted vegetation, the trees, we end up with problems with erosion, and that leads to sedimentation in the river and increased turbidity. And what that means is for the gill-breathing organisms in the river, it's much harder for them to extract oxygen. So when you've got turbid or sediment-loaded waters, those things with gills, such as fish, and in the Moorabool we have fish like blackfish, grayling, gudgeon, smelt, short-finned eels, all of them need clear water to extract oxygen through their gills. And what few people realise is that every eel that we find in the Moorabool actually was born somewhere in the Coral Sea. No one knows exactly where. And then began this amazing migratory journey, possibly 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 kilometres down the east coast of Australia. Gets down to the Victorian coastline where they think there's some kind of eddying currents actually toss them into the estuaries of the various rivers. And once they get up to the top, up to the Moorabool, that whole cycle begins again. And we're standing here in the Moorabool and you see an eel, and you think that it's undergone this amazing journey and that everything we do to the Moorabool River affects its potential to survive in the river.
So the Corangamite Catchment Management Authority is one of the overarching bodies charged with protecting the river and looking after it. A former chair of the CCMA said without action the Moorabool River will end up little more than a drain. Now we've seen that, experienced that in the lower reaches of the Moorabool. By the time the river gets near Geelong, it actually faces one of its greatest challenges, and that's actually making its way between the townships of Batesford and Finesford. Over that section, it actually gets channeled into large concrete culverts, which then have replaced the natural bed of the river. That's been done to allow limestone mining to access more of the limestone. As a result, we've got sections of river that were done in the 1930s, which are now in quite stark disrepair. That disrepair allows the water to flow out the bottom of the bed, make its way into the quarry. That water is then pumped out back into the river further downstream. As a result, there's a large section of that river which remains dry throughout much of the year. This is especially relevant in summer when we have migration of eel and different species that need a connected river to spawn, to migrate. With that dry section, this doesn't occur. And there's now sections of the river up from that part of the river where the fish life has almost disappeared, where it's only occasionally that connection is now being made to allow those migration of those species.
The Moorabool River was my playground as a kid, and I used to fish, walk and explore all the nooks and crannies of the Moorabool River. This spot here is sort of like one of the local playgrounds for all the local kids in the area. People used to gather here to fish, to walk the river, just to take in the sheer beauty of the river. Unfortunately, over the last 30 years, I've sort of watched the Moorabool slowly die, just due to the demands that are placed on the Moorabool River. The species of fish here was quite remarkable, and it used to really put a smile on my face coming fishing here. But today, a lot of our species are gone. This river used to be, I say, part of my soul. I have great fears for the future of the Moorabool, and those links and the relationships that people have with this river are disappearing.
My grandfather and grandmother came here in 1941, and we are very flow dependent on the river because our pump pool isn't particularly large, so if the river stops for any length of time, it's a bit of an emergency for us. All our stock and domestic water comes from the river. We don't have any dams here, so what comes down the river is what we use. The millennium drought was the main time that we lost water flow through here, and that was for something like 5 months. And that became quite a desperate situation for us as far as use for the farm and the household. It's a big concern, really, especially when there's talk of having less water in the Moorabool. You know, a lot of it is, watching the platypus and the native fish and things all through this stretch, and they practically all disappeared during when the river was switched off, and it's only just been over the last few years where we've started to see platypus return, and I guess the prospect that summers without water flow is going to make a huge difference to that and keep them at very low numbers, if not remove them from the river again.
We were lucky enough in 1989 to find this place, and we've been developing it ever since. It was a sheep and cropping farm, so we've gradually lessened that activity and increased the vineyard plantings to quite a large, for this area anyway, large planting area, and it's going very well. Without the allocation of water we have from the Moorabool, we would be out of business. You can't grow grapes without water, and you can't make wine without grapes. So the equation's pretty simple. I can remember about 6 or 7 years ago, we had a drought, and the water salinity levels are up around 3,000 parts. Now, you know, about sort of 800 to 1,100's the limit for us. So yeah, it's a big issue. It's not just the fact that you can't pump. It's sometimes you wouldn't want to pump with that quality. It's to say nothing. I mean, we feel pretty badly about that, but the fish and the platypus are having a pretty tough time as well. So we have to speak for them. The allocation is at 100 meg. We tried to increase that earlier, but there are no more increases to be given on the system. The system just can't handle it. So that's our allocation. We don't use it all every year. It depends on the conditions, of course, but generally speaking, we go pretty close to that. As we all know, the river is over-allocated and it is very stressed. There's a lot of talk about changes to the system. They're all heading in the wrong direction, not the right direction, as in more over-allocation. The people in this valley are pretty passionate about the environment, and I know in our case we've planted tens of thousands of trees in the time that we've been here. We're trying to give back to the environment, and you know, it's difficult when you have a situation like we have with the Moorabool, where everyone's trying to take their share of the water, but there just isn't the resource there.
Landowners might not express it overtly, but I think the river is really, really special to people. And I think that obviously it's got its utilitarian value to people who are primary producers, but it's a lot more than that. I think that seeing platypus in the river, hearing koalas in the trees, having these amazingly huge river red gums really is valuable to people and gives them an experience of joy that has a lasting value and meaning for people, and feeds into people's sense of identity too. I think if they're living near the river, it becomes part of who they are. The locals have seen it almost die and are quite nervous and conscious that it's been pushed to the brink. And the general sentiment about the Moorabool River is that it has had so much taken off it and so much stress placed on it that it's got nothing left to give.
Programs such as the various land care programs, the various revegetation programs, particularly in this buffer area, this riparian area, the area closest to the river, are so critical as filters for collecting that sediment that washes in from the cleared landscapes and providing the shading, but also the organic input. So all of these leaves and sticks and branches and other organic matter that goes into the river provides a vital food source for all those tiny invertebrates. And they're essentially the bottom of the food chain, the bottom of the food cycle that your fish, your frogs, your platypus, birds all feed on. So we lose those invertebrates. It's very hard to then establish anything further up the food chain. I mean, it can't be tokenistic, you know, you've got to be having the two together. If you haven't got the flows and you haven't got the riparian vegetation, you're only, you know, solving part of the problem.
Back in 2001, I started working on a project called the Moorabool Gorge Recovery Program. So it was a 5-year program, and basically the objectives of the project were to revegetate the Moorabool Gorge between the water supply catchments, so on the east and west branch of the Moorabool, and basically down to Sheoaks. The project was meant to stop that salinity from discharging into the river and prevent sediments and nutrients from entering the waterway, so just basically improving the water quality. In the long run, most of the farmers that I dealt with along the Moorabool River ended up being really supportive of the project. I worked on the Moorabool River for probably 8 years, and you know, there were days when you wondered how you were possibly going to get 1 million trees in the ground, and you'd come down to the gorge country and just sit by the river, and you might look up and see a wedge-tailed eagle flying above. It just all made sense then that, you know, this was such an amazing area, and it needs protection and commitment from everyone.
Once we understand our rivers are in trouble, we can't just sit idly by. We have to start talking about it. We have to start educating people. So we have to start talking to each other about that. We have to talk to our children, talk to our friends, talk to our family, talk in our community about it, and then get a bit more stroppy about it and start talking to our water corporations, to our governments, to our MPs, and say, well, look, what we're doing here is ruining our river. We won't stand for this. We want it to be different. We think there are solutions. We think we can capture more water in our cities. We think our rivers need a fair share of their water. We think that there are things which could be done to change this.
So my PhD was on the West Moorabool River, right here, and really trying to understand how it's changed over time and what's driven that change. And I suppose in some ways, trying to have an eye to the future, if we want beautiful rivers like this to, you know, be around for society in the future, you know, what do we need to do that kind of balances the needs of, you know, obviously the agricultural community that depends on rivers like this, the urban community that depends on rivers like this. Urban areas like Ballarat generate a huge amount of water. Because of all the impervious surfaces from roads, roofs, you know, other paved areas, we get this massive amount of runoff that causes erosion and pollution to all the waterways downstream. The runoff that comes off those impervious surfaces in Ballarat is around the same as the total demand. That's a huge amount of water being taken out of you know, rivers like the West Moorabool. For me, it feels pretty rare to have a resource that you can exploit and actually do some environmental good. Normally it's the other way, you do environmental damage by exploiting a resource. And so I think there's a real opportunity to kind of just say, stop, hang on for a second, we're producing all this damaging excess of water in the urban areas. We've got a real scarcity of water in these natural areas. It's not rocket science to think, why don't we try to balance this a little bit better and try to have our cities produce and use more of their own water, and therefore try to relieve the pressure on these beautiful natural rivers so that they're there for society and the communities who live around them to enjoy.
So one of the big uses for the Moorabool River is for the water for Ballarat and Geelong. Both Ballarat and Geelong are growing at a fairly rapid rate. Now, the people that go there, they need to have water. So where's that water going to come from? Where is that water going to come from in a time where we're running into drier climates? How do we do that? We can't just keep taking more and more water out of groundwater. We can't keep taking more and more water out of the rivers. We've essentially, you know, reached our limit there. So I think the only solution really is through desalination. 97% of the world's water is in the sea. That's the big reservoir. If we can get desalination right, that's where the water has to come from for people. and leave environmental water for the environment.
You know, nearly everything that we consume in our homes and in our industries ends up at the treatment plant. It's an incredibly valuable source of water. It gets cleaned up, and vast majority of it gets either put in another river like in Ballarat or sent out to sea. It's an obvious target for much greater reuse of water. Ultimately, I would like to see it cleaned up to a standard where it can be put back into our reservoirs and contribute to the drinking supply. And if you were really going to join the loop completely, that's what you would do. You would use it. It's what they do in Europe, it's what they do in Singapore, they do it in many parts of the world, but we have to, maximise the ability to capture our own water. So recycle and reuse and send it round and round. We have to stop thinking of our cities as dependent on a river. You get water out of the river, put it through your households, and send it out to the treatment plant and out to sea. That is probably 19th century thinking, not even 20th century thinking.
When you're looking at the issues with the Moorabool, you've got to look at the wider catchment situation, and agriculture forms a big part of that. There are many dams in the catchment that are quite small and shallow and lose a lot of water in evaporation every year. Like in this environment, you can expect to lose a metre out of a dam just to evaporation. So we need to be looking at replacing a lot of those small, shallow dams with deeper dams that have a much bigger volume to surface area ratio, so that we don't lose that much in evaporation. And in addition to that, if those dams are fenced off and planted with indigenous species, we also kick a goal with the ecological aspects too, and make them little ecosystems in their own right throughout the catchment. So it's not just a case of water in farm dams though. Since European settlement, we've lost so much carbon from the landscape, the loss of trees and the loss of carbon from the soil. Soil water holding capacity has decreased markedly, so that when there's a big storm, the water runs off and does great damage and fills the river with sediment. What we need is to put carbon back into the soils and rehydrate those soils so that the catchments stay greener for longer and the water seeps out over a long period of time, so that there's water for the river during the summer. But farmers shouldn't have to do this on their own. The government, via the CMAs and Landcare, need to provide funding to be able to do this, because it's in the interest of the broader community to make more efficient use of the water that's available so that more can be returned to the river.
We're really calling to build some more resilience back into this river, and that really takes some hard thinking and some will by government to acknowledge that we've overtaxed this river far too much and that we need to do something to bring it back from the precarious position it's in now. We've got to start getting some of the water back that or leaving more of the water in this river than what we've taken out as what comes out of our own drinking taps. We've got to take the responsibility to pay a little bit more. It may well mean that we're paying a little bit more for water. In the Central Region Sustainable Water Strategy done 15 years ago, they flagged that when Geelong and Ballarat start using recycled water as part of their drinking water mix, there was allocations that were to come back to the Moorabool River. Those allocations add up to nearly 5,000 megalitres. That's double the environmental flows that are in at the moment. This was all done 15 years ago. The debate that we're having now, that just seems to have been lost. We have to be looking at recycling water. We have to be looking at desalinating water, and we have to be looking at stormwater reuse. All of these things will mean that we can leave more water in rivers like the Moorabool. If we want to double the population in this region, this is the only way forward. We should grasp this opportunity now. We should say, okay, we're going to step into this new future of sourcing our water elsewhere rather than the low-hanging fruit that the rivers have been traditionally, and actually move to a future that enhances our rivers and gives us alternative sources of drinking water.
So we were called the Watharung tribe, the water tribe in essence. We've been here a long, long time. Meawan we call it. Thousands and thousands of years of history of living and sustaining life along a living entity which is the Moorabool River. It's got Dreamtime stories associated with it. Moorabool's a monster that lived in the water. My people have been here thousands of years. Colonisation is about 227, but we're all here now, and this place is worth fighting for.
And soon as we only talk about the river in terms of quantification, as soon as we only talk about it in terms of gigalitres or allocations or entitlements, but not as an amazingly diverse ecosystem of living organisms that have all sorts of qualitative values that enrich our lives in so many other ways that can be counted, then we lose something, I think, very inherent about what it is to be human.
We seem to have lost the idea of rivers from our kind of cultural core. They have become a bit of a focus for environmental fights and for allocation disputes, but it still amazes me, knowing what I do now of this extraordinary river, that there can't be a wider valuing of it as something that's very important to keep in our lives.
The river and the system, the valley is a part of us now, and we won't be here without the river.
Water veins etched into the land, west and east from Wombat Forest, north of Morrison's, lull Sheoaks across the flat western bustle plain, with a confluent trickle under concrete into the Barwon. Treasures are alive, but at risk. Deep pools and billabongs are collie, platypus, river blackfish and short-finned eel. Manna and swamp gums and the blackwood. The Moorabool, the Moorabool. are dry and depleted. In a once fertile, now worn and parched land, the footprint of development has dealt a heavy hand. For the Moorabool, the Moorabool. Water veins connected back to the heart, protected, sustained, enabled, healthy and strong.